You know, especially if you do the direct train and you don't change. And it's not delayed. It is, yeah. I find it's quite good, like, you can kind of get the work done.
It's just for the choice. Right, so it's like...
Welcome to all of you to this launch and event for the Edinburgh Companion to Animal Studies, edited by Lynn Turner, by Undine Sellbach, and their colleague Ron Brolio, who's not flown all the way from Arizona to come and join us, sadly. So I just wanted to start by giving you a bit of an overview of what we're going to do for the next couple of hours together. Start by introducing the three speakers on my right. Yoriko just told me such a fantastic story about terrible mispronunciations of her name. But anyway, Yoriko Otomo is the editor of Law and the Question of the Animal with Routledge from 2014, and a co-editor of Making Milk, the Past, Present and Future of Our Primary Food from 2017, author of Unconditional Life from 2016. Geez, you did a lot. Before she liberated herself from the wonderful world of academia. She's a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, governor of the Network for International Students, and on the board of Minding Animals International. And later she's going to present from her contribution to the companion that revolves around law in particular. Undine is a senior lecturer in philosophy at the University of Dundee in Scotland, where everything is better, we hear. So if anyone would like a better life, talk to Undine later about moving to Scotland. And as a Scottish national myself, I can fully endorse this. Undine is co-editor of the Companion, of course, and currently completing a book called Speculative Ethologies on Jacob von Uexküll, which we really hope is going to be in the Performance Philosophy book series, which I co-edit with colleagues for Palgrave Macmillan. She has essays on the animal in Angalaki, Parallax, Deleuze and the Non-Human, various other places. And then finally, Lynn Turner, who many of you will know from here at Goldsmiths, as the editor of The Animal Question in Deconstruction, co-author of Visual Cultures as Recollection, as well as co-editor of this companion. I love how we all have the line about currently completing our monographs. I'm still currently completing mine that I started before my daughter was born 3 years ago. But Lynn too is currently, but I think she actually is, completing her monograph exposing deconstructions, animal and sexual differences for Bloomsbury, and of course senior lecturer here in Visual Cultures at Goldsmiths. And I think, so we're going to start, the editors wanted to find a way of kind of bringing all 34 of the contributors to their brilliant book into the room, bring those voices into the room. So they're going to begin by offering one sentence from each of the contributions to give a flavour of those plurality of voices. Then Lynn and Undine will talk a little bit about their experience, or from the point of view of editors of the Companion, and then you're each going to present for about sort of 15 minutes or so in relation to response to your particular contributions, and then we'll have time for discussion, and perhaps discussion sort of in between and as we go along, if there are pressing questions that come up along the way. But let's start, shall we, with the one sentences to bring the Companion into the room with us.
This is unrehearsed, by the way. Completely unrehearsed. Okay. Oh, thank you.
I think we should stand and not go.
We should. Oh, and we're thinking of this as our kind of
a poet editorial kind of mode of realising 535 pages. Is the mic on? Are we all good? Good to go? Excellent. So, a part, pussy, stands for the whole, women, while that part is already transposed into a diminutive pet whose sole attribute is that it can be grabbed.
Animal abjects.
Few things can affect us so deeply as the plight of an animal.
A dog is a stone.
The scientific proposal of a new epoch of Earth history, the Anthropocene, puts the anthropos, or man, firmly at the centre of dynamic Earth systems, and once again brings the concept of the human and its modes of differentiation to the fore.
Insofar as the art world has become the site of zoo dramas, it has become a crucial site at which to explore alternative sensorial capabilities.
Biopolitics, particularly as developed by Michel Foucault and his Italian interpreters, has little to say about animals or animal studies.
Yet there are signs that a new spirit of capitalism is afoot today, one bound up with a growing company of animal souls whose vitality and sociality promise to give market economies a new lease of life.
Moreover, Jacob says of the mother bacterium that once her DNA passes to her daughters, she disappears but doesn't die.
Translation, in the form of reading and thinking the mute eloquence of those animals with whom we cohabit, is our impossible obligation, a necessary step towards rendering our freedom and our empathy just.
Sometimes, after this, I could stroke her fur. She would sit on her haunches and put one of her hands in mine while she ate with the other.
Since the middle of the 1980s, the ravens of Vermont and Maine have been the recipients of some strange gifts. Carcasses, some of them weighing 150 kilograms. Some of them, animals never before seen in the region, have been mysteriously appearing in the forest.
The Beiji is, or was, a freshwater dolphin found exclusively in parts of the Yangtze River.
Everything is part of the buffet of the universe, Ms. Bathsheba, a Louisiana schoolteacher's statement to the children in her class.
Perhaps, more than any other beings, animals have borne the material burden of cinema's explorations of movement and stillness, life and death.
Pet sales are the preferred outcome, but meat is the bottom line.
The post-19th century sense of our shared animality has given way to a sense of unique fragility.
All this, and more, I learned from a wildly playful and sometimes dangerous horse, whose fire-eyed, split-down-the-middle brown white face earned him the name of Manhattan, corrupted from the Ojibwe Madwejan, the herd flowing of where the two rivers meet.
Just this small sampling of the stark realities concerning the current situation of animals provides ample temptation to believe that resistance to the present is essentially hopeless.
The very idea of man lies slumped in the ditch, buzzing with flies.
Porter the dog is thereby unceremoniously hanged, followed by a monologue by Farmer Carter on the loss of his dear friend.
Having escaped otherness and conformed to the relationship endorsed by society, they are too recognizable to be noticed by their fellow humans.
Life is a self-transformer, a minded, disparate body that is learning and growing in response to the press of signs. Those bones once meant jaw, and later they came to mean ear.
The microbial level of life that inhabits every human and non-human
as well as their environments, forms at once a connection with an ancestral past and a post-human future of life on this planet.
This suggests how intelligence, thought, and even human philosophy are still and the same bodily postures, material and animal.
The web, a picture of the fly at the very edges of its world, made by the spider, is momentarily turned by her mate into a musical instrument, effecting a precarious movement of meaning from food to love.
As Portia spiders recreate the ways of flailing of many other insects, they participate, I argue, in the protean impulse found in a word.
In a perhaps unwittingly queer formulation of infantile development, Lacan argues that, contrary to heterosexual matrices that would align identification with gender, sameness and desire with gender otherness, a single instance of both desire and identification impels the female pigeon towards sexual maturity.
Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, biologists employed race and species synonymously, which is why Darwin's description of the several races of the cabbage sounds odd to our ears, but would have been perfectly intelligible to his contemporary readers.
Animals are good to think with, particularly at the limits of human knowledge and comprehension, where our conceptual powers begin to strain.
Like an open secret, the animal revolution is a voicing and a calling of difference.
The aliens create the context in which Jill must develop intimacy with the dogs.
For a number of reasons, extremophiles provide the key examples of the kinds of bodings who occupy this indistinct zone at the intersection of life and matter.
More speculatively, we might wonder how the postures of humpback whales singing tails closest to the ocean's surface upend our visual map of evolution.
And this brings us back once again to the hardest case, to asking, without knowing in advance, who are these animals I am following?
I think I'm extemporizing now, right? Laura is? Yeah. Oh, she's looking at me in an interpolative way.
Over to you.
Well, just to briefly offer some kind of introduction to the book. So for those of you who haven't had a chance to see it yet, before it enters into its affordable paperback formats, the Companion was first published in 2017, and it's got 34 essays from a quite sort of mind-blowing roster of contributors. So kind of 20 years on, maybe from when we might mark the beginning of animal studies as a cross-disciplinary field, there's some of the some extremely well-known figures in the field like Vinciane Dupre, Nicole Schuchen, Kerry Wolf, addressing the relationship between non-human animals and humans from a diverse range of perspectives, including themes around empathy, affection and friendship, to capitalism, death and extinction, and with respect to a range of arts practices from film, literature, voice, performance, in order to think with a multitude of species and singular animals, as you put it in the introduction. So from Bambi and Balthazar, Cecil the lion killed by a tourist playing safari hunter, bees, rats, sharks, ravens, hermit crabs, as we heard. And one of the things that struck me about the introduction in particular is the call that the editors make for what Vinciane Dupre might call a kind of accumulative rather than eliminative approach to thinking about animal knowledges. So a kind of and, rather than either or embrace of plural accounts of human-animal relations. So kind of taking in some of the forms of knowledge making about non-human animals that might have been hitherto dismissed according to a certain sort of form of scientism, maybe as mere anecdote or anthropomorphism. And so in this sense, it seemed like they're also following a similar call made by Carrie Wolf, who has talked a lot about how kind of animal studies is not just about adding the animal, as you discuss in the introduction, as a kind of a new object of study, but really calling on us to think about how we think alongside non-human animals. So that kind of the method of the thought itself, in terms of what perhaps Laruellians might describe as a kind of the ethics of thought itself, the ethics in thinking itself, some kind of mutation or transformation by animality of what counts as thought, rather than simply adding, as you put it, the animal to lists of existing humanities topics. And I was thinking this problem of how you don't merely include by analogy or by resemblance was a kind of recurring theme perhaps in a number of the contributions, and maybe something we can talk about in discussion. So whether that's in terms of thinking about the moral inclusion of the animal, how we move beyond a sort of extension of humanist rights to the animal towards a mutation or transformation of the notion of rights themselves, or in terms of our embodied behaviours, or in terms of kind of the epistemologies perhaps of the animal turn itself. The other thing maybe about the introduction and how it frames the companion is very much as a kind of a call to activism in the context of crisis. So just to give you a couple of quotes from the introduction. In an era where many hard-fought protections for animals are being eroded, finding ways to acknowledge other animals as sentient subjects socially, legally, and imaginatively remains urgent. And I appreciated, I think in particular, the kind of intersectional approach of the collection, if you like, that includes concerns with speciesism as part of a wider consideration of social justice, rather than, you know, falling into the trap that perhaps the animal rights movement can be accused of kind of turning toward the animal in a way that turns away from human injustice of particular groups. And the kind of the sense of urgency around this collection was struck home to me also by listening to Radio 4 yesterday, that font of all radical thought, where there was an Inside Science program where they were interviewing the primatologist Frans de Waal, who's known for his concept of anthropodenial, a kind of tendency to ignore or refuse to see a continuity of human-animal properties, where the framing of the discussion was basically kind of, do animals have emotions? And it's like, Jesus Christ, we're in 2019 and he's still having to talk about the capacity for animal emotion. You know, not to say that we don't need to continue to explore what we mean by that idea, and the idea of kind of the problem of analogy pertains to the idea of emotion too, but the very idea that he would have to kind of defend the view that primates, that chimpanzees feel to another scientist kind of reminded me yet again of the importance of the contributions included in the volume here around affection, around empathy, toward, you know, in the light of this impolite question, as Dupre would put it, about their capacity for feeling. That's probably enough from me, but it's a wonderful book. I highly recommend it. Rich in resources and all different kinds of aspects of thinking about the animal, but one that's particularly contemporary to my mind in terms of looking at how racism and speciesism are complexly entangled with each other, for instance, in ways that mean that animal studies is not just thinking about justice in a closed sense, but in an expanded and complex sense alongside other forms of oppression. But I'll now hand over to Lynn and then to Undine to talk about the editorial process a bit.
Thank you. I think we've got a few thoughts about what we might say, but we might do a bit of mic sharing and a bit of back and forth here in an improvisational way. The year was 2013, and I just submitted the manuscript of The Animal Question in Deconstruction, which is a very different type of book, and was generated completely differently, and it was much more specifically engaged with the work of Derrida and deconstruction more broadly, Cixous, Nicolas Royal, etc. Translators of Derrida, thinkers of Derrida, and really kind of taking up his own suggestion that his work had always been thinking about the animal and doing this kind of archival investigation of much earlier works. So it had been quite delimited, even as I was thinking of especially The Animal That Therefore I Am as a kind of a dynamite that was set amongst the humanities, exploding our conceptual inheritance in ways that I did not find destructive, but profoundly enabling and exciting as a thinker and as a living entity in the world. Albeit one that maybe didn't quite suddenly make everybody else in humanities scholarship realize that deconstruction had never been about language, as I thought it might. So I kind of done this book, and the press, Edinburgh, who've been supportive from the point of view of commissioning, immediately said, there's kind of a lot of work in the field now. It's kind of exploding and burgeoning, and there's really a lot of people doing incredibly exciting and completely new work with what we might call the animal question. Do you fancy doing like an advanced collection of cutting edge new work that would be, commission whoever you want, it can be big. I thought, okay, I will do that. If we're not going to do something that's an introductory text, but I can ask whoever I like around the world to write something that both points to the existing kind of field and might point to existing bodies of work, but also reaches beyond that and really tries to think creatively. And actually, there's quite strong anchorings in continental philosophy, which was kind of starting to happen anyway, but I think that we really nurtured that. So that was wonderful, and I had full license to, I thought it's going to be big, I can't work alone. Undine and I had previously worked together on a parallax issue called Bon Appetit, and at that time she was based in Australia, so I thought, great, I'll have my girl down under, and then I'll have Ron Brolio in Arizona, who was doing kind of extraordinary work with what he was calling a kind of post-humanist phenomenology, and we'll just see who bites, and we'll just write to everyone that we want to write to, and I think we're probably about 4/5 of them said yes. I mean. So we really had a lot of free rein, and I have to say that Undine and I worked like maniacs. So did Ron also, but we really worked like maniacs on shepherding these 34 chapters into the world and saying, actually, can you push this a bit more? Please take a risk. So that there is a speculative quality to some of the writing. There's a real range of types of writing, types of addresses, and of course a kind of discontinuous investigation of the animal question. And I suppose, and do interrupt me as chair, Laura, because I'm really aware that I teach at this institution and I can go into a lecture at a moment's notice, so I can be stopped, can take the microphone away. But just something on the animal question, because I think of the three of us, I'm probably more invested in deconstruction than these guys. But I think that what's really important there, and I'm drawing on moments from a set of interviews called For What Tomorrow, when Derrida says, the animal question is not one among others. It's not this kind of additional component that identifies like a separate subset or species. It's something that does speak to, and he's addressing the West, right? So this could be completely different if you're in like a non-Western context, but he's speaking to the kind of vicious inheritance of Western philosophy and the ways in which this kind of imagined once and forever divide between the human and the animal infects everything from legislature, jurisprudence, how we think about ethics, how we think about rights, how we think about morals, our daily lives. It has this huge kind of knock-on effect. And there's somebody narrowly interested in ethics, and somebody increasingly interested in a kind of, how am I with others in the world? Who am I with others? Which others in the world? It kind of starts kind of opening categories that traditional forms of humanities scholarship would have in quite tight boxes. So there's something profoundly enabling about, I'll stop blowing down, Derrida's trumpet, as it were, but there's something profoundly enabling there for me. I was going to say something about, we can probably say this together. I'm going to say something about, it's 2019 now. It was actually published last year, not 2017, so we've only had a year to reflect. But it was it was quite a long process. So we're quite serious, very much hands-on editors, and we didn't quite realise how entangled in other people's lives we were going to be. So some contributors kind of came in and out of being able to contribute. Some had to withdraw from the collection for personal reasons, and including, we wanted to make a particular note that we're really sad to lose the contribution of the now late Deborah Bird Rose, who was going to write a chapter on Indigenous ecologies, but unfortunately was too ill to proceed with the chapter. Had subsequently died very recently. But there was a kind of feeling of, I don't know, which take up my half sentence about.
So I guess it's just that strange part that you play as editors, where we've never sat in the same room together with everybody from the book, and yet through that kind of correspondence and the process of reading and reflecting on the work and the iterations and that period of time, there is a kind of a sort of sharing of a life and a world, and some of the kind of hard material processes that you're all caught up in as well. So I think, that for us, that was why it was so important to do something like the reading at the beginning, where, we're calling everybody's voices into the room. So, I don't have a lot to add to what you're saying, Lynn. I think, I suppose just a few things come to mind. One is, I think when we're working on the book, it was also this time where the kinds of creatures that might populate an animal studies companion, that there was an incredible kind of opening up about, I suppose the kinds of animals that people were becoming interested in, and the kinds of relationships, that we're caught up in. And so, you know, there's lots of insects, and there are there's a whole chapter on extremophiles, and there are a lot of which are also thinking about geological and ecological processes, and the kind of different ways that living creatures are caught up in that.
Do you want to say what the extremophiles thing is?
You explained this extremophiles because
it was such a hard chapter. I tell you, it was so hard. The tiny, tiny, tiny little things that live in the world's most impossible spaces and kind of almost are inextinguishable. I think that's pretty much all I can say.
They live in vents at the bottom of the ocean.
Places where life should not live, right?
Yes. But I mean, the chapter was also looking at the way that this kind of life gets very easily captured in commercial processes and processes of capitalism, even albeit in speculative ways. But I guess, I mean, the other thing that that to me was a moment that was important to us in putting the companion together was that sense, and it sort of builds on really what both of you have said, that a kind of thinking in the company of and where you're open to being affected back by other animals really, in a sense, puts pressure on and maybe expands how we might think of what it is to pay attention, to ask questions, to notice, you know, and that some of the more familiar ways we think about doing those things perhaps aren't always adequate, you know, and I think about that a lot with my own work when I write about insects and creatures which kind of often are at the periphery of our focus. And I think it's there also in many chapters where, for example, in the chapter in the Anthropocene, where we're thinking about geological processes and things that don't kind of register as the centre of the picture or representation. So I really kind of loved the way, and I think I felt that when we were reading out the sentences as well, that calls for this more inventive way of writing. And so there's the need for the analytic and the critical and, you know, the technical terms, but there's also a need to be really open to crossing different registers, you know, to address things that can't fully be captured, you know, maybe in the, you know, any single kind of knowledge form. So I think to me that was one of the kind of important things that came out of working on the companion.
I think this is just coming out of what you're saying, because it's not like other books, actually. I think even now, and even at the moment, that the context between 2013 and 2019 has massively changed. I mean, when I was working on this stuff, when I wrote my third animal studies essay in 2008, it was published in 2010 in a journal called Animalia. I mean, I was pretty much having to spell out words to some of my colleagues. You know, oh yeah, I'm at this conference, it's called Zoonotechnics. And it was like, what the hell is she doing? What's happened to this girl? She went away and she came back completely different. But now, I mean, some of my PhD students, however, you know, illuminatingly brilliant they are kind of inhabiting London, and like, I can't move without a gallery doing like an animal event. They're everywhere. There's compost, there's like cephalopods, they're like really big. It's like, I can't move without a tentacle. And there's something that is on the one hand, it's kind of amazing that, you know, the more than human is noticed in some way, but it's also sometimes becomes maybe a little pat. And I think that we, across the book, you know, the various contributions really do try and push those kinds of ethical kinds of moments, and kind of expose the kind of different scales that may make new connections and actually may make profound disconnections. I mean, part of Undine's, you know, whole research is around, like, you know, in what way am I ethically in relation with those that I cannot, you know, apprehend? this is something profoundly difficult. And of course, we also know this is the same with people that we apprehend perfectly well on the street, and we still manage to walk past them. So, I mean, there's a whole range of kind of different kind of entry points there.
I'm going to go here because my eyesight is failing. All right. Rather than reading out a section from the chapter, I was so excited about coming here that I wrote a new paper that speaks to the chapter. Animal law is key to understanding the politics of our human condition. We think of animal law as being primarily about animal welfare or conservation, but law's impact on animals' lives is ubiquitous. Indeed, if we are to look for animals in law, we see that they are everywhere. Whether by their presence or in their absence, animals can be found in every kind of law: trade law, planning law, intellectual property law, tax law, the list goes on. In these laws, the symbolic form, indicated by its proper name, is often substituted by the desecrated body. We have pig, pork, skin, leather, family, stock, cattle, beef, breast, and udder. Or alternatively, animals may take different forms in law altogether, appearing instead as risks, substances, activities, and metaphors. While some welfare or conservation laws treat certain animals as being good and others as bad, others place them on scales that determine which will be sacrificed and which will be saved, depending on their symbolic or their material value. Examples of this are animal welfare laws that separate pets from food, from scientific models, from pests that can be killed on sight. So much campaigning for law reform is focused on trying to improve the law. In animal rights fora, campaigning seeks to extend law's magic circle of protection from humans to apes, to elephants, to whales, and so on. In animal welfare fora, campaigning seeks to improve the comfort of animals. The battle is pitched as being between the bleeding heart liberals and corporate interests. And in this paradigm, animal rights and animal welfare movements presume law to be a neutral or benevolent medium that can be shaped to progressive ends. But in fact, animal law isn't inherently good or even neutral. Welfare laws provide minimum standards for a select handful of animals while denying them every single one of the rights that we would consider to be the most basic features of the good life: freedom of movement, bodily autonomy and integrity, sociality with members of one's own species and family, and of course the right to life. As endangered species protection can be read as a euphemism for the preservation of the right to exploit, so too can animal welfare laws be read as a euphemism for the preservation of the right to violate animals. So the female European food chicken, for example, is guaranteed accommodation of 750 centimeters squared until most are killed at 6 weeks of age, kindly, of course, by electrocution. The male chickens in the egg industry are gassed or ground up alive when they're 1 day old. Chickens have a natural lifespan of 8 years, and these are the laws that are heralded as being world-leading. And also, every law that impacts on animals validates certain ontological categorizations or hierarchies of value. Every law that affects animals binds them into an ideological, ontological, economic, political frame that demands our complicity. In order to reassure ourselves that we're different and special, we must simultaneously know and pretend not to know the scale of this horror. So what I'd like to invite you all to do is to think about what it means to be complicit in these biopolitical projects, not only for each individual of the 60 billion land animals killed each year for food, and the global extinction crisis triggered as a result of our bacchanalian overconsumption, but what that complicity means for how we imagine what it is to be human. So I'm going to take a few minutes to explain what this means. How law's engagement with the animal exposes a deep anxiety about humanness, which in turn reveals the political problem for our generation. And I'll let you in on a secret. It's bigger than Brexit. In my chapter, I've given detailed examples of the cow, the elephant, and the dog, showing how law's production of animals is embedded within a long-standing colonial and class project. I don't have time to tell those stories here, but I can illustrate the broader point about why this is a problem. So, the sovereign state, as an independent political entity, was authorized in 1648 with the signing of the Treaty of Westphalia. This marked the end of the Holy Roman Empire's claim to universal jurisdiction. Before that time, we see human-animal relations that were very different to our modern schema. So individual animals and groups were tried for crimes across Europe, for example, both as perpetrators and as victims. Human-to-animal breastfeeding and vice versa was common. Human-animal sexual and domestic relations were a matter of serious regulatory concern, with frequent intervention. The way in which Roman law produced an existential force field around humans that stopped them from becoming indistinguishable from the rest of the world, from the rest of nature, was by creating different domains. There was the domain of res extra commercium, which means things outside of human commerce, which included res nullius, things that belong to no one, and res nullius included wildlife, the seabed, and space. It included res sanctae, which means sacred things, including churches and graves, and res publicae, things owned by the state for the public good, such as city walls and public squares. In effect, this allowed for some human commerce in earthly goods, but ensured a sacred domain that clearly marked an existential boundary. Sovereign law, as the primary post-Westphalian claim to jurisdiction over humans, had to find its way of creating an existential force field. In the absence of divine power, the threshold markers then had to become, as Derrida says, the beast and the soul. Over the following 3 centuries, the intensive and pathological regulation of animals who had a dense symbolic significance became the primary means of marking the separation of humans from the non-human world. The term that I just mentioned earlier, res extra commercium, resurfaced in the late 1960s during the creation of the first global environmental law regime. So in the 1960s, is, when you're teaching international environmental law, is really seen as the beginning, is taught as the beginning of the field. So lawyers translated res extra commercium to mean common heritage of mankind, and they used it to describe the air, outer space, the seabed, and wild flora and fauna beyond the limits of national jurisdiction. Effectively, this reinscribed what was previously outside of man's remit to be his sole claim. If we turn to look at the 2 main environmental treaties dealing with animals, there's the 1973 Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species and the 1992 Convention on Biological Diversity. They contain statements along the lines of the following, and I quote, "Biodiversity should be treated as a natural capital asset and the economic costs of biodiversity acknowledged. The true value of biodiversity should be incorporated into accounting systems and prices." So there, biodiversity is declared to have a true value or an intrinsic value that can be captured by accounting systems and prices within an international market. And then these statements are followed by declarations such as, and I quote again, "Valuation exercises are ultimately academic, as the ecosystem services in question are essential to human well-being and survival, irreplaceable, and therefore priceless. Close quote. So here, biodiversity is declared to be a ground or condition of human survival as opposed to a tradable good. The formulation, so this formulation sets up a tension between perfect pricing on the one hand and pricelessness on the other. Non-human life is declared to have at once intrinsic value, ever-growing value, and value for humanity. Now, the work that these two international agreements do start to make sense. They function, in effect, to facilitate the consumption of nature that has intrinsic value. They both do so by emulating the religious economy, putting certain things outside of human trade, placing them within a logic of scarcity, the market, and then granting dispensations. And these dispensations make them available for trade and for consumption. So in nature, non-human life is priceless, part of a diffuse mass that's distinct from human life. And then in the market, this nature becomes a capital asset that has a true value, determined by scarcity, with traction within an actuarial political economy. The movement of non-human bodies between these two sites is enabled by first returning non-human life to the realm of the sacred, prohibiting trade in them altogether because they're endangered and threatened, and then authorizing them for consumption. So the battle over what happens to animals in the legal domain is not really between bleeding heart liberals and corporate interests. It is, and it always has been, a conversation between church and state. In conclusion, by refusing to step into the fantasy that law can somehow transcend the moral and political ambiguities that mark other kinds of engagements with animals, we can begin to see what impact law has on the human condition. If we look at animals as they appear in domestic and international legislation, if we really look at who appears and how and why, we begin to see that the story we're told about the emancipation of animals through the saving power of law starts to fall apart. So the political problem of our generation, which I alluded to at the beginning of the paper, is this: the fragile invention of sovereignty as a political construct that can secure the idea of the human in space and time is collapsing. We've come to the realization that we were, after all, part of the world, and that neither American presidents, nor Tesla's rockets, nor God, can guarantee that we're superhuman, as well as being only human. We need now to collectively stop wallowing in existential anguish watching cat videos and find different ways of governing our relationship to the world. And I do think that these alternatives exist, but not in the halls of power.
Very much. So now Undine will present and then
my chapter in the Companion is called Performance. And so I want to talk to you, I'm going to read some little bits from the chapter and also talk to you about parts of it. And so part of what we provoked this chapter were these little films that were about maybe sort of 10 years ago or so, and some of you might have seen, and they were called Green Porno. So they're little films, only 1 or 2 minutes long, and they're directed by Isabella Rossellini and her collaborator Jodie Shapiro. And after a while, and they kind of emerged at the time when people started watching things on their phones. I don't think I had a phone that I could watch films on at the time, but I came across them anyway. And then they were later woven into a live theatre show under the same name. So this was really the starting point for this work for me. So for those of you who haven't seen these little films, I will give a short description. So Rossellini simultaneously narrates and acts out the reproductive activities of invertebrates with the aid of scientific data, pantomime costumes, cardboard props, and painted sets. Each film opens with the words, "If I were a bee, a fly, a snail, a bedbug, an ant, an earthworm." And then she goes on to identify the animal's distinct physiology, its sensory capacities, the number of limbs, the reproductive organs, the parts of the environment that might matter to it. And she acts out the mating behaviours and other everyday activities. So to do so, she often plays different and sometimes shifting sexes at once. So for example, in Praying Mantis, she is the male, her mate a cardboard cutout puppet. In Bee, she is queen, daughters and drones. In Snail, she is hermaphrodite. In Wasp, she is the mama wasp who buries a paralysed caterpillar with egg so that when her babies hatch, they can eat fresh meat. So in 2013, Green Porno was turned into a live theatre show, and this was I went along, my daughter was about 4 months old, so this was her first theatre show I took her to see. And it was delivered as a performance lecture, so I saw this in Australia. So speaking from a lectern, Rossellini adapts many of the gestures and the costumes of a kind of formal academic inquiry. And then she interjects with a series of live reenactments and short film vignettes. In these performances, she turns her body, along with props and everyday objects, to act out the sexual and the maternal instincts of the small animals she's interested in. So this isn't a kind of CGI recreation. It's not a high-tech visualization of complex data for a popular audience in ways that might make it easy for us to digest. Instead, as collaborator Shapiro points out, invertebrate ethologies are acted out almost as if you might be able to do them in the kitchen with your own kids. So it is this strange juncture of instincts, animal and human, with philosophical questions about our lives with animals, with performance, with scientific pedagogy, where somehow children and researchers and small animals all get mixed up in spaces together. This is what I would be interested in considering. So before turning further to Isabella Rossellini's lecture hall, I want to begin with some thoughts on the performance lecture as a genre and its importance for animal studies. And these are just very brief thoughts. I think this is such a kind of, there's so much rich material here. So I guess while all lectures are also performances, for the most part, this staging goes unremarked in order for the topic or the object of study to be the focus. So put simply, one might think about a performance lecture as a particular mode of academic address which doesn't fully naturalise its own staging and makes visible some of the gestures and conventions of its own thinking and desires. So were one to tell a history of the performance lecture for animal studies, it would have to include things like the emergence of the anatomical theatres for staging direction in the late, dissection, in the late 16th century. It would include things like the creation of the Royal Society in 1663, a community of scholars who met to discuss the conduct and the communication of science, to reflect on how one might do this best. How do you study animals properly? It would also include many, perhaps more recent, critical and imaginative engagements with this tradition. Franz Kafka's A Report to an Academy from 1917, Ludwig Wittgenstein's A Lecture on Ethics from 1933, J.M. Coetzee's The Lives of Animals from 1997, and Coco Fusco's Observations of Perdition in Humans, a lecture by Dr. Zira, animal psychologist, from 2013, are all philosophical performance works that have been influential for the field of animal studies, which are given in lecture form. A live event, a performance lecture, is nevertheless often delivered indirectly and in multiple ways, as a report and story in Red Peter, a transcription in a lecture on ethics, a film and documentation in photographs, observations of perdition. And in the case of The Lives of Animals, it was delivered as a lecture that was later published as a novella within a and also at the same time published within a collection of academic essays about animal ethics. So in the performance lecture hall, the wondrous and idiosyncratic is prone to suddenly interrupt the learned and the analytical. In the midst of a lecture on ethics, for example, Wittgenstein wonders what might happen if one of you suddenly grew a lion's head and began to roar. In The Lives of Animals, novelist Elizabeth Costello rejects what she sees as the reductive language of scientists and ethical philosophers talking about animals, and calls for a sympathetic imagination where stories and performances might open up a shared exposure or sense of animal embodiment and vulnerability. So I think it's sort of interesting to think about green porno and Isabella Rossellini's performance lecture as a further iteration of this tradition, and as also part of animal studies. But I think it's also different in really interesting ways. So to begin, the animals interrupting Rossellini's academic address are not apes, with whom we share a close evolutionary history, lions, or other wondrous beasts of prey. And they're not cows, sheep, pigs, or chickens, animals which we farm, kill, and eat. In fact, there are no large mammals in green porno, instead an assortment of small living things, including various insects, worms. There's some anchovies, there's a snake, a hamster, and a duck, whose reproductive canals are narrated by Rossellini as the subjective agents in the film, rather than the duck herself as a sentient subject. So all of this brings these tensions to the fore in terms of how we might understand green porno and its implications for animal studies. So on the one hand, by extending a kind of sympathetic imagination, the imagination of if I were a, and the performance of these worlds, and to extend this not only to include larger mammals but small instinctual creatures, it might seem that Rossellini is bringing these creatures into ethics, into our familiar codes and language to do, and evoking feelings that might shift, how we approach and think about these creatures. But this act doesn't necessarily, in her work, confirm or affirm a kind of recognizable sentient state. And so you think, for example, in a kind of utilitarian ethics, if you can demonstrate a kind of capacity to suffer, then this is what brings a creature into, into animal ethics, and this is an extremely important argument to make. But there's something that starts to happen with the scientific attentiveness combined with the strange kind of imaginative evoking of these worlds that doesn't kind of mirror back to us, perhaps, emotions that we can kind of recognizably see or recognize as held in common. And perhaps even that shared sense of vulnerability, which Coetzee evokes so powerfully in his book, The Lives of Animals, is not necessarily confirmed either. So what kind of performance is this? What kind of animal pedagogy? So in the big version of this chapter, I go on to think about this in two ways. Because I guess I'm interested in thinking both about the various human instincts that are mobilized in the lecture hall once we start to think about sort of small instinctual animals in our company, and also to think about kind of scientific and ethological and biosemiotic understandings and accounts of the instincts of animals. So in a longer version of this paper, I go to the work of Julia Kristeva, who opens up a way of thinking about our own instincts and their kind of embodied gestural dimensions through her work on the semiotic. And I'm interested in the kind of mobile and unstable ways that kind of lives of animals with other animals can strike. These responses, so that they sit alongside maybe what we might see as more legible ethical emotions. But then the second part, which is where I really want to focus on and end with, is to turn to the field of ethology, which is trying to give this sort of richer account of the instincts of other animals as well as perhaps our own. And so here I'm interested in the way that a kind of ethological imagination mobilizes and in turn might affect our own selves and the most instinctual edges of us. So to explore this, I'm going to bring an interlocutor into the lecture hall. And this is an unconventional biologist called Jakob von Uexküll. So he is writing in the first part of the 20th century. He's an Estonian biologist who writes in German. And in 1934, he publishes a small book on animals and their environments, which is called A Foray into the Worlds of Animals and Humans. And it has the subtitle, A Picture Book of Invisible Worlds. Now, this all sounds a little bit like a book for kids. Or you might say perhaps a popular science book, a way of connecting a bigger public to science. And indeed inside, alongside the diagrams, the experiments, there's a series of watercolour paintings of a village street through the eye of a human being, a fly and a mollusk. And later on, in a further essay called A Theory of Meaning, we meet a spider who paints a picture of a fly with its web. And there is also, perhaps most famously, a tick who performs as a blind and deaf highwaywoman. And there are numerous sections on counting, on experimental sound making, on gastronomy, on finding home, and on getting lost. However, Uexküll doesn't intend a foray primarily as an education book for kids or as a popular science book. Instead, it's written in dialogue with the dominant scientific approach of his time, one that has, by the way, shifted in many ways, through the kind of pioneering work of Uexküll. But in this paradigm, animals were studied in terms of mechanistic behaviours, and the kind of complex relations they had with their environments largely went unconsidered. So, responding to this, Uexküll calls for a shift, what he calls a sort of shift of address. So when a researcher approaches an animal and starts studying it and asking questions, that they might approach that creature as a living subject, actively sensing and interpreting their environment. And so this is an incredibly kind of confounding thing, because in so many ways these are worlds that the researcher can never physically experience or access. But his provocation, in a sense, is that science will start asking far more interesting questions if they begin with this more curious comportment. And so he asks us to blow in fancy a soap bubble around the small creatures we encounter. And so his name for this bubble is Umwelt, or a surrounding life world. And you might also think about it as a stage where the world of an animal is performed from the inside out. So where the different things that matter to an animal and those things that are indefinite or indistinct to a creature are articulated. So his work has just been extremely influential in science, in philosophy, and has been really a kind of key to a lot of arguments that are made in animal studies. allowing for rich accounts of subjectivity, agency and co-affection, and pointing to a real focus on the ecological relationships that animals are participating in. Nevertheless, that fanciful picture book part of his work tends to be downplayed. And this is a caution which goes right back to early readers of Erskine. For example, Carl Lashley, who wrote the first English translation to his work in the early 50s, he warns, and he's very respectful of Erskine's work in lots of ways, but he cautions, and this is a quote, "Although the descriptions of the animal worlds give the readers a feeling for their experiences, this empathy is illusory and sometimes misleading." He goes on to describe Erskine's technique. Working from within one's own world, a researcher must attempt to find a way to cultivate a feeling for an animal in its world. So though these comments are kind of intended as criticism, they help make visible that improvised pantomime dimension of Erskine's scientific inquiry that is often downplayed. And they point to the way that more than providing a kind of new model for animal-environment relations, Umwelt is a mode of performance, a bubble blown in fancy twice, by the small animals anticipating their environments, and by us as researchers turning familiar words, objects, gestures, scientific knowledge, and everyday kind of parts of the world around us in ways that cultivate a sense or a feeling for something, or an intuition for something we cannot know. So while science often aspires, or we think of it at least as aspires to giving a complete picture of the animals that are studied, for Erskine we might better understand this as a picture book of invisible worlds, where the word invisible marks the way that biology in its complexity and strangeness requires an improvised response from us. So just to finish off, I want to kind of take Erskine as a presence in, take him seriously maybe as a presence in Rossellini's own lecture hall, and end with some remarks about green porno. So we might understand Rossellini's green porno as Rossellini's own picture book of invisible worlds, or if we were to consider the setting at once academic and filmic, as an invisible picture hall. In an interview about her approach to art and science collaborations, Rossellini says, "It is not as if scientific knowledge always arrives fully formed, and the job of the artist is simply to convey this in an engaging way. Sometimes science itself lacks the words to explain the phenomena that are being studied," and she talks about the entomologist E.O. Wilson's way that he invents the word superorganism. But for Rossellini herself, she says she has a somewhat different technique, and she says, "When I'm studying something complex, I draw. That's how my films come about. The scripts are a series of little drawings." So Rossellini's ethological drawings are then acted out as films and as live demonstrations within the lecture hall. And in the process, one might say she amplifies that improvised pantomic dimension already at play in Erskine's scientific writing, and she reassembles our own familiar domestic items, often objects taken from the kitchen, eggs, knives, ping pong balls, cardboard, to fabricate ethological worlds. So in the process, strange slippages start to occur between the ethological and the personal. So that mid-lecture, Rossellini briefly interrupts her lesson to recall that her father, Roberto Rossellini, once likened himself to a Jewish mother, speculating that he might have enjoyed the ability to change his sex. Never quite a monologue, the academic lecture theatre is always, as Rossellini puts it, the academic lecturer is always, as Rossellini puts it, in conference with the small animals they study, their various human audiences, and with their own desires, instincts, and playful edges. This eclectic bringing together or being with, as Desprez might say, is possible perhaps because different philosophies or different epistemologies or ways of knowing, ethological, psychoanalytic, ethical, are not posited as competing scholarly positions, but as living, thinking, partial gestures that might set into precarious compositions. So here we might even imagine the familiar strangeness of the human psyche and the alien strangeness of nature partaking in conversation.
All good? All right. So, I had the luxury of choosing my own topic, because I was queen editor. And I'd already done like a lot on deconstruction. I was, simultaneously writing stuff, pedagogical material on why deconstruction is really important for kind of rethinking our relationship with everything. So I think we should do it on feminism. There's loads of other people I kind of want to do that chapter, even though none of them did in the end. That was really annoying.
We tried.
We tried so hard. So I kind of took a leaf out of my own book, and I kind of went back to Derrida's grammatology, which kind of informed massively the thinking that was shaping the chapter on voice, particularly the writings around Rousseau. And increasingly finding everything is in of grammatology. I just need to have cultivate enough Zen to actually be able to decipher it, but it is all in there. But I was simultaneously somehow cetacean life, acoustic pollution, acoustic ecologies of the ocean were being increasingly brought to my attention. And I thought, can I actually read stuff that I'm not trained to read? Can I actually read kind of ethological literatures? Can I delve into research onto cetaceans? What would happen if I did that? Would I be able to bring a theoretical lens that was already at play? Or would I be able to kind of work out of that? What would happen? I did read quite a lot of net-based stuff, which was cascading rapidly at the most sublime kinds of rates. I mean, there's one of the many actual books that I read was by D. Graham Burnett, and it is kind of an interesting lesson in humanities scholars kind of stepping outside their comfort zones, because it's a chunky monkey 656-page book or something. And in the conclusion, you can kind of feel the author reeling. And he's like, I've written a really huge monograph. I have got 10,000 pages of notes. And I do not know whether I have any authority to say anything with any degree of conviction. This is not a story of, well, the animal cannot speak. Or Rousseau, the animal cannot sing. Or any of the other multiple cannots that the concept of the animal produces, as Derrida demonstrates and argues. But in this kind of array of materials that I kind of went in and out of, I'm just going to read what I think is the most digestible bit in this kind of format, which is a section from the middle of the chapter, which is called the estrus complex. It's fairly short. So, writing against the elevation of the narrow field of language by psychoanalysis, and there's also a lot in the chapter to do with trauma studies and psychoanalysis, right? But writing against the elevation of the narrow field of language by psychoanalysis in light of the wider category of the trace, Derrida alights on what Jacques Lacan determines as the capacity to pretend. So capacity, ability, to be able, this wretched notion of capacity that we kind of inherit and operate all the time. So in Derrida's account, the Lacan of the écrit does permit animals some complexity in communication, by virtue of the ability to pretend in the specific circumstance of seduction and combat. But he refuses them the redoubled capacity of pretending to pretend or to lie, or even to bear witness to a lie, and hence the whole juridical scene is kind of conjured even if it's not spelt out. This redoubled and mendacious capacity is pivotal in Lacan's account for language, and is characterized as the possession of humans alone. Embedded in the logic that fundamentally splits nature and culture, seduction and combat are excused as need, and thus as natural, in contradistinction to the lie as the convener of culture and of the signifier. And because I'm like a rabid bibliophile and I've got access to library funds, I've just ordered a gargantuan collection on the category of deception, which is huge. It's like 3 times our book size. I don't know how it's holding together, but it's everything you could possibly kind of think about in terms of what it is to deceive before the law. As is well known, Aristotle credited humans alone with the capacity for speech while sharing the wider category of voice with other animals, naming man in his politics as a political animal, very well known, a political animal in a greater measure than any bee or any gregarious animal by virtue of his sole possession of speech. In the history of animals, Aristotle goes into some physiological detail about why he finds this to be the case. The fact is, he says, that no animal can give utterance to voice except by the action of the pharynx, and consequently such animals as are devoid of lung have no voice. And language is the articulation of vocal sounds by the instrumentality of the tongue. Thus the voice and larynx can emit vocal or vowel sounds. Non-vocal or consonantal sounds are made by the tongue and the lips, and out of these vocal and non-vocal sounds, language is composed. Consequently, animals that have no tongue at all, or that have a tongue not freely detached, have neither voice nor language, although they may be enabled to make noises or sounds by other organs than the tongue. In the case of the dolphin, he goes on, the dolphin, when taken out of the water, gives a squeak and moans in the air. But these noises do not resemble those above-mentioned non-vocal noises. For this creature has a voice and can therefore utter vocal or vowel sounds, where it is furnished with a lung and a windpipe, but its tongue is not loose, nor has it lips. He doesn't know about phonic lips. Nor has it lips, so as to give utterance to an articulate sound. So other animals may make noises or even voice, but they are physiologically barred from rendering those sounds articulate. Notwithstanding Aristotle's limited familiarity with cetacean physiology, including what are now called the phonic lips, internal to the nasal passages of odontocetes, the problem of articulation will resurface in various forms, actually across the whole chapter. But whilst this legacy distinguishes between a categorical distinction between inarticulate voice and deliberative speech as predictive of the polis, the Enlightenment one, exemplified by Rousseau, imagines a political community that is yet informed by impassioned voices beyond speech, while still distinguished from animals. He has to go through quite some hoops to make that, to enforce the concept. If articulation is keyed to meaning in the former, for the latter, Rousseau, it also presents a threat. Indeed, as of grammatology routines the problem, articulation is a dangerous supplement on which the living is Derrida's category of grammatology, on which the living, not humans, alone depend. And this dangerous supplement is what I would call a vulnerability, modifying ability. So while humans have apparently only been taking note of the songs produced by whales by virtue of underwater microphones or hydrophones over the last 50 years, it's remarkable how many marine researchers repeat Aristotle's view that, and I quote, all animals, without exception, exercise their power of singing or chattering chiefly in connection with the intercourse of the sexes. In her recent work on humpback whales, the now most famous singers of the deep, philosopher Denise Russell draws attention to what we might call a failure of imagination, when whale song is framed by many scientists entirely as the work of seduction. Males sing in order to attract a mate. And to date, and this to date is probably 2016 at the time of writing, to date only males have been observed singing, although, and as an index of the pace of new information in the field, recently recorded, 2015, recently recorded extra deep notes from humpbacks in their breeding grounds near Maui have caused scientists to speculate as to whether this previously undetected range near the lowest limit of human hearing might announce the sound of females after all. Russell goes on to point out the numerous exceptions, numerous studies of when and where whales sing in excess of proximity to sites where they are known to reproduce. Philosopher and musician David Rothenberg, who has himself played the clarinet to humpbacks through undersea speakers, goes so far as to say that while many bull whales have now been observed singing in over 30 years of study, no one has concomitantly seen females rushing towards them. Rothenberg also points out our striking lack of attention to the sheer volume of sound made by whales, sounds which must surely have been felt as vibrations by those exploring the seas when those seas were teeming with such lives prior to naval recordings. In counterpoint to the doubts raised by Russell and Rothenberg on grounds of lack of visual evidence, and there's the whole history of visual culture is kind of being played with here as well, Philip Hoare has offered another twist on the same refrain, made all the more curious given his own extensive research on whales and experience in their company. And this is from a lecture he gave fairly recently in Bristol. He suggested that male humpbacks produce specifically penetrating bass tones in song in order to stimulate estrus in females. This is my anthropological voice. Their higher notes would be effectively produced by default as they run out of breath. The apparent absence of females enthralled song would then be beside the point, since sound travels faster in water than in air, and these whales are among the loudest beings on the planet. Hoare's story, moreover, works to further embed not just the concept of the animal as that repetition machine whose creativity is purely procreative, but the feminine as that form of sexuality wholly determined from without through the agency of masculine inscription. The equation of breath with note, perhaps, echoes only the paucity of what human physiology might perform should we attempt to make sounds underwater. Certainly it runs counter to studies of the structure of whale song, studies such as those by the Whale Trust map patterns of a 4 to 6 theme sequence in each humpback song. Each sequence lasts 10 to 15 minutes. Each song may last hours. After each sequence of articulated sound, the whales then surface to breathe. Cetacean oxygenation is not like our own. In their book, deliberately titled The Cultural Lives of Whales and Dolphins, biologists Hal Whitehead and Luke Rendell detail the ethological study of what sounds are being made and by which species of cetacean. While nothing remotely like a babelfish has emerged to translate whatever it is that is being sung, they note with great interest not just that humpbacks are particularly loud, nor just that they sing the same song in groups and in isolation, not just that their songs change over time. Rather, groups of whales apparently learn songs that may change over a surprisingly short time, like over the course of a year. The songs then travel, pop songs, among different pods of whales around the world's oceans. More speculatively, we might wonder how the postures of humpback whales singing, tails closest to the ocean's surface, upend our visual map of evolution. We are all too familiar with the ascent of man, diagrammed as the vertical ascension of a white man walking into the future, away, above and beyond his more horizontal, hairy, dark hominid ancestors? What might be the thought of evolution from land back to the sea, in the case of cetaceans, say? It could imagine a journey that does not order an ascent, in which a descent cannot be mistaken for the fall, rather than the horizontal plane surpassed and surveyed by the vertical. It would move from horizontal to any direction. This speculative evolution might also chart a journey not from smell to sight, Freud's narrative of the erection of the human, but from smell to hearing. Returning to the water from land, as Whitehead and Rendell point out, cetaceans maintained their mammalian dependence on breathing air. This allowed them to develop speed of movement in the water by virtue of oxygenation, as well as vocal communication.
So we have about 20 minutes or so left for some questions, some conversation. If you have thoughts, darkness. Followed by wine. Followed by wine. And there's no wine if you don't ask.
Some nibbles too.
I might start with one thought or question that comes from the book around where you would position yourselves, all of you, in relation to the kind of the animal studies versus critical animal studies distinction. So one of the chapters, the one on biopolitics, brings up this distinction, whether or not you think it's a valid one, to suggest that there's a kind of a more activist dimension to critical animal studies, or and a particular emphasis on capital, or the impact of neoliberal capitalism on the nature of human-animal relationships. And I guess I was also thinking about it in relation to your paper, Yoriko, about kind of what the role of law is in relation to that activism, or the kind of distinction that you were making between the kind of progressives. It's not about the progressives or the liberals versus the corporate interests, but the church-state relationship. So it's not a very precise question, but it's a companion to animal studies rather than critical animal studies. But how should we hear the relationship of the book to some of those kind of activist demands, what this work should, or how it might position itself in relation to creating positive change for actual animals as well? Do you want to respond on your paper?
So I took the opportunity to write in a critical animal studies voice, because animal studies, as it's taught in pretty much every university course that I've encountered, is animal studies, not critical animal studies, for law in law schools. So I know this is different in human animal studies and other disciplines, but particularly coming from a cultural studies background and teaching in a law school, it's been very important to think through the implications of Derrida's work in particular. So The Animal, Therefore I Am, when that book came out, that triggered the edited collection, Law and the Law and the Question of the Animal, which I thought was terribly important, because the animal rights movement has been active in law since the 70s, since Peter Singer was doing all his work. So Stephen White, there's a big, a very strong movement, particularly in the US, around animal rights, as well as and a strong animal welfare movement in the UK and Europe. So sometimes it feels a lot like shouting into the wilderness by myself. So everyone looks a bit askance when I say, thinking about animal studies in a progressive way has to be critiqued, but I think it's important nonetheless. So yeah, I'm definitely writing it up.
Well, I'll just say something briefly and then pass on to Lynn, because in fact, the original title had critical in it. And it was an interesting experience for us, because the reason we pulled it out was we realised, I suppose, that there was a gap between the maybe very diverse sense of what critique might be that we probably brought, and the idea of it just being pigeonholed too much in a particular kind of, you know, tradition of animal studies. And this isn't what we first heard, but then when we spoke to people about the book. And so I think that it's absolutely true that critique and not stories of thinking about animals in a narrowly conceived, this is our specialism way, but thinking about those kind of complex social, political, you know, geological processes that, you know, surround animal studies is very important. But I think one of the things we wanted to do was also not suppose a genealogy for animal studies, and in fact there's a chapter in the Companion which is called Genealogies, and you know, which hopefully is a kind of inventive and open way of thinking about the trajectories and the stories we tell, you know, about this field. So I think that kind of reduced title ended up being a way of trying to keep that open.
I will. I mean, I'm going to segue into some of what Undine was saying. Because, I mean, the diverse histories are overlapping and unclear at times. For example, one of the contributors, Dawn McCants, who is an absolutely extraordinary scholar in my view, technically like professor of like religion in Manitoba. But meanwhile writing like the most extraordinarily and utterly singular philosophical kind of treatises, and she has a book called like Medusa's Ear, which is about, you know, hearing between like Kant and Hegel, that's kind of like shot through with kind of deconstruction taking the ground from their feet. And she's really extraordinary. She has a deceptively titled thin book called An Introduction to Critical Animal Studies. And I have to say, I mean, I've been a reader of Dawn's work for a long time, and I'm using her chapter on death here as a reference point for things that I'm thinking about now in terms of relationship to the history of the death penalty, for example. But I mean, her book is not a CAS, critical animal studies, abolition from top to bottom, do not deviate, do not pass go. It's only about abolition. It is a critical in his book in the sense of critique and in the sense of crisis, which we kind of reflected on kind of in the introduction. But meanwhile, you know, her book was reviewed as the world's worst book, I think, by some within the CAS community, because it opened onto other kind of critical scenes, and it is part of the kind of deconstructive and kind of post-deconstructive shift in emphasis from rights and how do we establish rights, legal framework, to a question of the ethical, with perhaps a more infinite horizon that the ethical might point to, inhabit. I'm trying to think of the right kind of verb. It's not going to slap me in the middle of a horrible concept. Yeah, but I think that a critical move between a legacy of rights. You know, the mission is like, for example, I mean, the Great Ape Project, and you know, of course I would reference Carrie Wolf's work here. Signally, strategically, I would support the notion of attributing and lobbying for basic human rights for the great apes, you know, the right not to be killed, not to be imprisoned, not to be tortured. While simultaneously wanting to, it's always the double gesture with deconstruction, while simultaneously wanting to open up the archive of how do we construe rights, and upon what juridical grounds are these rights supposed, and what juridical histories do we kind of, you know, also kind of maintain.
Yeah, and I mean, actually, that makes me think as well. I mean, something that was happening that felt very important to us at the time we were writing the introduction. There were these legal shifts in New Zealand, and so a river in New Zealand was declared a living entity with, I mean, most of you will have heard of this, and this has happened in India as well most recently. In the case of New Zealand, this happened through an extraordinary 140-year battle by the Maori community to have some kind of semblance of recognition of this of the river as an entity that was the ancestor within the law. And I think, to me, what was so interesting here was that this wasn't the case of taking simply a kind of category that's emerged through the history of kind of Western law and then just imposing it to open up some more rights. But the very category of what a legal, well, we know a legal person can be a corporation. We have this idea of personhood, but these things begin to be put under pressure and transformed out of the, the cultural context and rich, extraordinary arguments and incredibly long history of material kind of arguing for this change in the law. And so I think, there's a kind of enormous importance to pay attention to the way that familiar concepts that we have might be being transformed back.
Can you shout, or shall I pass?
Oh, sure. No, it's okay. It's okay. So thank you for that. It was very, very interesting, and congratulations on the book. It looks just even looking at the contributions already expands my notion of what animal studies is or what could be, and sort of the importance of it. I was wondering if you could elaborate, because you said, I think it was Lynn, you were talking about in the beginning how during the editorial process you were really challenging the contributors to push it a bit forward. And I was just wondering if you could elaborate on how that unfolded, or a few examples of like.
Sorry.
So did the text end up being a bit more speculative, or like how did it sort of materialize?
I think that I think we're just pretty hands-on as editors, and we don't care about famous people. We think that they can be edited too. I mean, we do care about famous people because lots of famous people are in the book, but everybody was read very seriously, and everybody had acres of, and some people were like, go to print. This is really kind of amazing and very succinct, and others it was just a very kind of an ongoing kind of back and forth. I mean, some were. I mean, the poetics chapter is really kind of like an intricate, unfurling kind of curious kind of piece, and others are more kind of are more didactic. But I mean, I'm just thinking about in terms of the conversation about critical animal studies. Like, I mean, Richard Iverson, for example, who's actually his PhD is from Goldsmiths, interestingly, cultural studies, hardcore vegan, serious militant guy, but really Extremophiles chapter, and he was like, this is just like, this is confounding ethical territory, and there are speculative aspects there in terms of military appropriation or desire to appropriate extremophiles, because if something can exist where nothing can exist, what can we do with that? And it's kind of it's not something that can be brought back into but can the extremophile feel pain? It's living in a ridiculously, I don't have the numbers for it, the temperatures of heat or freezingness that it's defying, but no, it's probably not feeling pain. So it just cannot be kind of recouped into a kind of classical utilitarian argument to do with, can they suffer? The question that Derrida so completely reworks. I mean, do you want to say something more about the work?
Well, I guess, I mean, I mean, I think there was the initial process of just making sure that everyone felt that they could be as inventive as possible, because I think there's always that process of thinking, am I doing more of a summary kind of chapter and things, and so we had those back and forth conversations, but I think as the book evolved, I mean, it's a strange position to be in when you are an ear to all the different, I mean, this is the position of the editor, of all the different contributors, but they're not all, we're not gathered at a conference together, or we're not all in a room together. So I think, you know, and this would happen, I guess, in any large edited book, there's that process of, you know, sometimes you're driven to kind of ask a question or to suggest, you know, it would be lovely to know more about this, or to draw in a distinction or a complication because you have that perspective on the bigger company. But it's a difficult thing because you also, you know, I think we're also often holding back with that as well. But that was definitely, there was a process of us thinking about the company of the companion in a way in our critical responses and the feedback.
I'm just thinking about some of the other chapters that were more experimentally written, like the Extinction chapter, which is absolutely extraordinary and kind of beautiful writing, Matt Krulu and Rick DeVos.
Evolution.
Is that Evolution?
Yes, you're just thinking extinction.
Because Extinction's everywhere. Okay. Is it Evolution? No, it is Extinction. No, Evolution is Tom Van Doren.
Do you want me to
also,
open the book?
I'm sorry, I misheard you. So Evolution is Tom Van Doren.
Yes. I'm talking about Extinction.
Sorry.
Man, I'm talking about Extinction, yes, death. But they do lots of deaths. Big death, little deaths. So it is an incredibly elegiac, beautiful sequencing of like micro histories of the lost and the, you know, the disappearing. But yeah, so there's range.
I think that those different registers are important.
Sure, please.
So, the statement that it's not definitive, there's, you know, and maybe you could revocalize that line as a response. This is a fairly blunt and cruel question, but after you've seen all the essays, the dust has settled, what do you think's at stake? Because certain animals, certain species put voice, pain, empathy to crisis. We don't really know what we're talking about when we talk about pain. We're asking, does it sympathise with pain? So really I want to say, if you had to choose, and I think you'll say it's probably not the animal that's at stake, and it's not the human that's at stake. And it may not even necessarily be our perception of a relation or a difference. Is it really, you know, getting to approaching the philosophical note of, is it language and thought that animal questions at stake overall? I know it's not a question, I've answered one.
Well, I mean, I guess, we might begin with Laura's comments at the beginning that the very way that you might understand language and thought is under pressure and is at stake, you know, because, you know, there's a sense of how might you write and research, you know, and study animals in a way that recognises that there are animal ways of thinking and comporting and maybe even doing philosophy that don't strike at that same kind of cognitive way that we often perhaps narrowly use to corral who we are, but that are also present. And I think even when you go to kind of creatures like extremophiles, that sense of the performing of certain distinctions and the rendering obscure or unimportant of others, you know, that there's an incredible kind of sort of importance of kind of living and knowing that we're in the present. We're not the only, creatures that are doing that.
I mean, I think obviously there's not a nutshell here. I mean, the book, in a sense, I always tell this moment, this kind of story in terms of kind of a real kind of wake-up call and a prompt in terms of kind of rethinking, who I am and who we are in the world, and what kind of histories we are inheriting and what histories we are, making possible or impossible. It was that moment when the World Wildlife Fund, basically in the last 50 years, this kind of gargantuan percentage of the world's species, the world's wildlife have gone, so specifically the world's wildlife are dead or extinct. And I just thought, God, so if I make it to being 80, make it to being an old woman, does that mean that there'll be nothing left apart from animals that are farmed? And so I suppose that's the kind of ethical kind of shockwave that was really kind of influential, and those kinds of statistics are changing rapidly. It's like 50%, it's 60%, and it's really, really shit. And I feel I'm getting into that mode where I can't say anything hopeful, because I suppose that my kind of excitable academic antennae are truly innovated. Innovated, is that a word? Excited, is in a good way, by just these possibilities for rethinking so many of the reflexes that I've been taught. And part of the kind of macro lens would be the kind of shedding of or a process of shedding of the kind of 1980s and early 1990s sedimented kind of humanities pedagogical environment that was strongly Lacanian, ergo strongly dialectical. That is the massive history of dialectical philosophy. And I suppose in the nutshell baseline would be therein that nature and culture are fundamentally divided, and all of the kind of toxic consequences of supposing that relationship with the world. Now, I mean, obviously I know about your own researches, and I am amongst other areas, really, really intellectually interested in not saying, and no one's saying that what we're doing in these performances, which I call them performances, in these readings that we've just been doing, that the technicity of the spoken word isn't something particular, but it's the ways in which operation of the trace, repetition of difference, inhabit every other mode of marking that starts to make me think otherwise. I mean, a gesture, Derrida will talk in grammatology that auto-affection, the capacity to be moved, self-affected, is the characteristic of the living in general and not of the human. It's like, okay, so what does that mean? How do I take account of the living in general? I mean, the consequences are just are vast, and they present themselves at the times when we are most in crisis, right, worldwide, and in so very many kind of macro ways. Our ability to respond actually is kind of being shrunken, not a word, being reduced by kind of macro political structures. I feel like a tear coming on now. Whilst surges of hope come through, the astonishing work that what is her name, Greta Thunberg has been doing. Although obviously we're all going to die still. I think it's still too late, but but here we are. I've gone into my sad place now. It's too late.
Sorry. But it's an intellectually interesting place to end up.
So your question was what is at stake, and I think obviously there are all these massive ethical implications. But for me as a legal scholar, and I've got my wheelbarrow, and that is what's at stake. So the question of the animal throws into question the entire field in which I work. So I mean, the humanness is at stake, is it not? Why would you argue that it isn't? Oh, okay, I misunderstood. But I think it's incredibly useful for thinking through the siloed way in which we structure our entire political economy. You know, the work that law has undertaken, the work that domestic and international law has undertaken over the last 400 years, and the way in which the sovereign state is implicated in that, the way that we know ourselves as a species, the way that we reassure ourselves as a species, calls into question what we're doing with law at all. And I think it opens up the possibility of radical change. I mean, the recognition of the river in New Zealand as a living entity, the recognition of the river, the Ganges and the Yamuna rivers in India as legal persons. These are extraordinary moments in law where the post-colony can rise up and say, no, we can do it differently. You know, that we don't know what will happen when we recognize a river as a living entity, but we'll do it anyway. And I think, you know, for us living in England, that raises a really interesting question. It's like, actually maybe we have heritages that are older or different to the Judeo-Christian heritage, the liberal, you know, humanist heritage. What about fairy tales? You know, what about the much older religions? How about different kinds of spirituality? You know, there are alternative ways of thinking in this country too, and in this legal culture too, that have been suppressed by a certain dominant voice and by certain dominant philosophies. And so I think it's on us to think about very creative ways in which to very strategically and precisely start changing the way in which we govern ourselves. So I try not to go into the sad place. Although all my classes end up really, really depressed. And everyone goes and has a drink at the pub. But
that hope feels like an excellent place from Lynn's sad place to
hope, to say thank you very much to all three of you for the work on the book, but for all your thoughts and your presentations today. So please join me in thanking all the presenters. And I believe there is some wine and some other things waiting for you outside. Thank you.